Hello, in this video we are going to explore how to do a Hong Kong seam finish. So with the Hong Kong seam finish, it is a very clean, professional looking seam finish. As you can see here, we have a beautiful bias tape that is covering up the raw edge of the seam allowance, and it looks very beautiful on the side with no stitching seen. But if we flip it over to the other side, you can see the back side of the seam finish, and it's actually the raw edge of the bias that is sitting here. So it's not another layer of folded up seam allowance, which we would have in per se a example of the bias bound seam finish. So this is something we see in a lot of inside of women's coats or men's jackets that aren't lined, possibly on the insides of trousers, things like that. It's again a very professional looking seam finish. So let's see how we do this. The first thing you're going to need is you are going to need to have your seam. So I would just take two pieces of fabric and stitch these together with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, or whatever the stitch line is of your garment. So the next step is to make sure that this is pressed open. Once we have it pressed open, we need to prep our bias tape. So this is single fold bias tape. You can see here that single fold is got the one fold in on each side. So you can buy this at the store, or you can pre-make your own bias tape if you know how to make bias. So the next step is to press this open because it's not quite prepped yet. In order for us to do the Hong Kong seam finish, we actually want to have this be flat open. So I am just going to press open my seam allowance here and flatten it. And so I have a nice flat piece of bias tape that will then be used to stitch onto my seam allowance here. So for this sample, we have this beautiful yellow fabric with the blue stripes. And so this is prepped. So the next step is to take my bias tape, and I'm going to line it up right along the edge of just one of my seam allowance. So I'm going to pull my seam allowance away like that and line this up. And I'm actually going to stitch a 1/4 inch away from the edge all the way down. And if you're using pre-made bias tape, there is like a little crease here that you can stitch down. So if it helps, you can use pins to just hold your bias tape in place. And so then I would go to the sewing machine and stitch that 1/4 inch seam all the way down. And then you're going to do it to the other side as well. So you'll have two sides that are prepped. So here I have an actual blue seam binding here. So switching colors on you a little bit. And you can see that I stitched it already. I pressed this open and it was stitched down 1/4 inch here. And we actually can see that it's stitched a 1/4 inch on this side as well. And so once we have that stitched on there, it should leave a really nice opening of the original fabric, the right side of the fabric, showing where our seam is. Then we are going to press this under. So this side, I'm going to show you how to press that. When I flip it over to this side, you can see there's the edge of my seam allowance. So I'm going to fold my bias tape right up along the edge of that and just press it nice and tight to that edge. I want to keep it as tight to that as I can so that it creates a nice crisp line there. And you can see the raw edge of our seam allowance just lays there. One of the advantages to using bias tape is that this is at a 45-degree angle, so it doesn't fray. It also is going to be completely protected because when we anchor this at the top and the bottom, whether you're stitching it into a seam or you have a hem allowance that folds it up, it's going to keep the seam pressed open, which is going to protect the underside of the seam allowance quite nicely. So we've pressed this side, we've pressed this side. Now we need to stitch it down. So this is the very last step, and we are going to stitch in the ditch. So what is stitch in the ditch? This edge right here where the seam of the bias tape meets the fashion fabric here is called a ditch. So we are going to be using our sewing machine, and we're going to stitch right along that edge. And sometimes I find it's helpful to go ahead and pin this so that the underlayer is laying nice and flat. You also want to make sure that you're getting enough of the bias tape. If this gets pulled over too far, if you stitch too much, like at 3/8 here, then this might not be wide enough and you wouldn't be catching this. It's important that you catch the seam allowance on the underside, but you're going to be stitching it from the top side of the seam allowance. So we would pin it on both sides. And I pin the one side, I would go through and I'd pin the other side. And remember which direction you put this into the sewing machine. As my sewing machine comes this way, I can then pull my needles out or pins out as the needle is progressing down the line. So I would pin the other side and stitch those down, back stitching at the beginning and the end. And then we end up with a beautiful Hong Kong finish. So you can see it's been back stitched down here and here. I did have a little correction here, but no issues. Can't see that from this side. And you can see on this side as well. It's stitched all the way down, really securing that edge, creating a very beautiful finished seam. So this is the Hong Kong seam finish.